Hello and welcome to this video on contemporary dance lighting for the dancer/choreographer. I'm Ansel Hollis. I'm a lighting designer with about 10 years of experience, 150 dances, give or take. I've been around the block. I am sought after by my employers not because I'm the best lighting designer out there, but because I'm a good lighting designer, and then I can also cover a lot of other bases depending on what kind of fires they need to put out. And it can be really advantageous for them to be able to hire me to do not only the lighting design, but also half of their technical direction, cover half their stage management needs, help them with some sound troubleshooting, or whatever comes up. The motivation for this video was a message I received on Instagram that reads, "Hi again, hope you've been well. I wanted to know if you had any classes/books, etc. you'd recommend for learning lighting. When I choreograph, I find that I struggle communicating my ideas to designers. I would also like more info/experience so I know more fully what my options are." So, I'm going to be addressing all of that in this video, and this is how I've laid out the topics. I'd like to start by breaking the ice with something that's not exactly related to purely lighting, but it's something I think will be helpful, especially for the newer dancer or choreographer, and that is common technical theater misconceptions, and I'm going to cover 3. The difference between a cyc versus a scrim, the difference between silhouette versus backlighting, and the difference between a blackout and a fade to black. If you already understand the distinctions between these, feel free to skip ahead in the video. So when we talk about a cyc and a scrim, a cyc is short for cyclorama, so it's spelled C-Y-C. I've seen it spelled all sorts of different ways, but this is the right way. It is the sheet upstage that is commonly lit in a solid color to provide a background for the dance. It is different than a scrim. A scrim looks more like this piece of translucent fabric here. It has a lot of small holes in it, and it's commonly used in contemporary dance a couple of feet downstage of the cyc to help the cyc become negative space in the event that you don't want any color there. Because if you have a big white sheet, then even if you're not lighting it directly, there will be light coming in and bouncing off of the floor and bouncing off of the dancers that is going to make it fairly apparent to the human eye that there is in fact a big white sheet down there and the figure-ground relations aren't quite as nice. So with the scrim there, it's going to be absorbing the light that is coming in at an angle and only letting light that's heading straight out the holes through. As a result, when you light the cyc behind a scrim, it's going to be darker because the scrim's in the way, but also more saturated because it's not getting as much white bounce lighting muddying the color. And it's a good move to put a scrim in front of a cyc, generally speaking. I see the cyc referred to as a scrim a lot, and I've theorized that stems from you're in one venue, and the piece of fabric upstage that you're spacing your dance out from is a scrim, and then you move to another venue, and so you're, in your mind, accustomed to the upstage piece of fabric being a scrim, when now the second venue doesn't have a scrim, it only has a cyc. So that's the distinction. Moving on to the second order of business, silhouette versus backlight. Let me see here. This is a silhouette. You light the cyc in a solid color, and then the dancer, by virtue of blocking the light with their body, forms a dark shadow. Just like this. When we say backlight, we're actually talking about this. The dancer getting lit directly from the back, from an actual light source at the back, not the cyc itself. So a lot of the time, even if we think you might understand the difference between the two, we'll still sit down and clarify, just because if you say backlight, we know you might be talking about this by accident, when to us, backlight means this. The third distinction is a blackout versus a fade to black, and this is very simple. A blackout is a fade to black that happens instantaneously. A blackout, by necessity, happens on a 0 count or arguably a 1 count. A fade to black, by necessity, happens over a long period of time and is a fade. Additionally, any transition that happens instantaneously is referred to as a bump. So you might say to your designer, I want to bump from the cyc to the side lighting, and that means an instant shift between the two. The next order of business is the philosophy of contemporary dance lighting. I like to start out talking about the philosophy of contemporary dance lighting by contrasting it with other forms of lighting design. If you are lighting a play that takes place in a hotel room, then right off the bat you have a script, because it's a play, and you have a setting that is going to be familiar to the audience, and they're going to be expecting it to be lit generally in a certain way, barring any special theme or concept that's driving that particular piece. The story and emotions that are going to flow from that script are going to be fairly consistent audience member to audience member. You may have one audience member who, the story that's unfolding reminds them of a particular point in their life, and it might have a certain section might have a little bit more emotional impact on that basis. But pretty much, the audience members are going to be getting the same basic thing from the play as they watch it. And the lighting is going to follow the concepts of lighting in a hotel room, roughly speaking. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the lighting wants to be perfectly emulating the light sources you would find in a hotel room, but even within the artistic liberty you might take, dimming a certain section of the room when actors aren't there, adding a little bit of extra light over near the focal area of where the action in that moment of the scene is taking place. Beyond that, it's still all pretty normal, pretty standard lighting, because that's what makes sense. If you contrast that with contemporary dance lighting, inevitably at any point in your higher education, if you go into design and production, one of your teachers is going to ask, what is it that we do here? And the answer that they're looking for is that we are storytellers. And I'm not sure that that is precisely true for contemporary dance. It's certainly true of plays, musicals, operas, ballets. But contemporary dance is a little different in my mind. And while it can tell a story, I think in a more broad sense, when we do contemporary dance, we are experience givers more than storytellers. And that leads to an important distinction in the lighting. Because these experiences that we're giving are not as predictable, audience member to audience member, as that play in that hotel room. The experience I might have watching a piece of contemporary dance may be very different than the person on my left or the person on my right or the choreographer. So, in a perfect world, you would want to actually craft the lighting to be specific for each audience member, which you can't do. And you would need to craft that lighting based on an understanding of how that choreography was going to impact them specifically, which you don't know. So what do? All of this is a very roundabout way of saying the lighting design of a contemporary dance piece should make it look good. That might seem kind of obvious, but that is a little bit different than that lighting design for that scene in that hotel room, which is to be a crafted version of lighting in a hotel room. That is to say, when you go in to try to make a dance piece look good, don't be tethered to anything that you might actually see in the real world, because the dance choreography itself isn't something that you're going to see in the real world. Day to day, I mean. So when I go to light a dance piece, I'm going to be trying to figure out the essence of it as best as I can, and providing lighting that helps it be the best version of itself. And for this, I turn to the choreographer the most to try to figure out what the essence of that piece is. Sometimes you're going to have choreographers who will say, I don't really know what this piece is to me, but far more commonly, the choreographer is going to have the best understanding of what they're going for. So because the choreography might speak to me in a certain way, and that way might be different than the choreographer, I think it's important that dance lighting follow the choreographer's intent and vision, because it's already going to be so hard in some cases for your emotional message to make it correctly, make it to the audience member in the way you intended, that you definitely don't need a lighting design that is pushing it in a different direction than you want. You want your lighting design to be helping you towards that original concept, unless the intent is to give lots of different people lots of different impressions, which is certainly the case sometimes. And this is as good a time as any to clarify that everything I'm talking about here, it's just a guideline. It's not a hard law. Even when we get into the design principles, those rules are made to be broken if you have a good reason. And on the philosophical angle, you're going to have stage plays that have a more abstract concept, that are going to impact audience members differently based on their life experiences, and conversely, you're going to have pieces of contemporary dance that are maybe more narrative-like or more rooted in reality, and the lighting may want to pivot to reflect that. So yes, take everything. I mean, there's really nothing I'm going to say today that is like an absolute take it to the bank, this is always true. Art just doesn't really work like that. The next topic is general design principles. And right off the bat, I'd like to say these come more naturally to some people than others. Some people, it seems like they don't even have to be taught anything, they just understand it. Other people can grasp it over time. And there are some people who just never seem to get a good grasp on it. For me personally, I'm below average for someone attending an art school, but above average for an average person. I find in particular, software developers have the hardest time grasping these. I'm not exactly sure why, but that's basically why all of our software sucks. Okay, so I've picked. There are a lot of design principles, but I've distilled it down to these 6 to talk about in relation to dance lighting. I'm going to start with value contrast because it's probably the most important. If you can get this right, you can kind of get a pass on a lot of the other stuff. So let's dive right in. In this example, this is a dancer lit from both sides in this instance and directly from the front in this instance. The model is the exact same. The brightness is actually the exact same, even though it doesn't look like it. The only difference is where the light is coming from. And you can see in this image, the light coming in from the side, when it falls over the 3-dimensional shape of the dancer, it provides a lot of information about how that object exists in 3D space. If you contrast that with the front light, that light is coming in and it's filling in a lot of those shadows that your brain would like to use to inform you how this object is actually existing in 3 dimensions. So when you have, this is an extreme example, it never gets this nice or this bad in theater, but if you say something looks flat, this is basically what you're referring to. Too much light is coming in from the front and filling in the shadows and the value contrast that makes the dancer look three-dimensional. So if you're kind of new at this and you've ever wondered why there are so many lights in the wings, it's so that we can hit you from an angle that makes you look more like this and less like this. So next up, we have symmetry. And symmetry is probably a concept you're already familiar with. There is a certain theory of aesthetics called the cognitive fluency theory of aesthetics that says shapes that are complicated but easy to remember are more aesthetically pleasing. And symmetry is a way to activate that concept, because you only need to remember half of this and also that it's mirror imaged to understand all of this. Additionally, if you have a symmetrical composition and you add something on one side that's not symmetrical, then that thing is going to stand out more so than it otherwise would. So it's important when you're looking at the stage picture, and this doesn't exactly apply to the dance as much as it applies to things like the masking, the legs, the Marley, the backdrop, etc., or any scenery, in some cases, you want it to be symmetrical so that it's not drawing attention to itself. You want all the legs to be lined up, or in the case that you want to do something like forced perspective, you want to bring all the legs in a regular way to make the stage look more deep than it actually is, but you definitely don't want to have one leg randomly in a little bit more than the others, because that's just going to draw attention to that leg away from your piece. The next item is unity, and this isn't just the unity of the lighting design. It's the unity of the design with the choreography, with the costumes, with the sound. Because if it's already challenging for you to get across your emotional idea, it makes it that much harder if the costumes are saying the mood is one thing and the lighting is saying the mood is another, and the sound is saying that the mood is another thing. If you have that much variety in those elements, if those elements aren't agreeing with each other, it almost doesn't matter what the choreography is saying. It's going to seem unsettling to a degree, and confusing and hard to follow. Now, that might be the point sometimes. This isn't something that you just have to, by law, always unify all the aspects of your piece. But if those aspects of the piece are not unified, it's something you should be thinking about and not doing accidentally. There's something that you should be doing for a reason. On the subject of figure-ground relations, this leads to the area I most consistently see choreographers make a design mistake. And I've seen variations on this conversation happen several times over the years, and it basically goes like this. We'll be in tech together, and they'll say, this piece has a warm energy to it. I want to see some warmth from the lighting. Maybe the costumes are warm. And they're never wrong about that the piece does need a certain warmth. But the way they go about it is generally if they try to kind of get in the driver's seat a little bit, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but you got to be careful. Because they'll get in the driver's seat and they'll say, okay, let's get some warm side light. And so I'll turn it on, and it'll look something like this. And then they'll say, okay, well, maybe we add some warm downlight as well, some amber downlight, backlight, something like that. Turn on some amber downlight, and the scene will look something like this. Which is interesting. It fills in these shadows with the saturate amber, and makes the dancer look a little bit warmer. And then they'll say, okay, um, what about some amber on the cyc? So I turn it on, and it looks something like this. And at this point, generally the choreographer kind of goes, and they get a little stuck. Because they can tell that this isn't quite the stage picture they had in mind, but they don't quite understand where things went wrong. And ultimately the problem is with figure-ground relations. Now these figure-ground relations could be worse. When you have side light that's hitting only the dancer, not the floor or the cyc, it's gonna make them brighter, and it's going to do good things for your figure-ground relations. So just by virtue of having the side light on at all, they're moving in the right direction. However, because you've got downlight that's amber that's piling up on the floor, and you've got amber cyc light as well, now the warm light that's hitting the dancer isn't actually that warm anymore in relation to the rest of the scene. Whereas, now your dancer has a certain warmth to them relative to the scene around them. This is an extreme example, but nothing about the lighting on the dancer has changed in terms of the side lighting. The downlight has changed to blue, and the cyc light has changed to blue. But now the dance actually has a certain warmth to it in terms of the dance, the dancers, the choreography that's moving, that it didn't before. And now, if you increase the saturation of the side light in order to balance out the saturate blue that you've added into the rest of the scene, you start to have something that the dance itself has a warmth that it wouldn't have if it was just on against black, and it definitely wouldn't have if the rest of the scene was also warm. The next design principle on the list is focus. Using lighting to guide focus is fairly simple to understand in theory. There are two basic ways that focus can be achieved in a composition. The first and most common for the performing arts is a focal point that is brighter than the rest of the composition, and dance actually has this fairly easy through the use of their side light. The dancer is naturally going to be brighter than the surrounding scenery just by virtue of the fact that you have light coming in and hitting only the dancer. So if you're lighting the floor with X amount of lighting and then bringing in more side light on top of that, you pretty much don't have to worry about the floor getting brighter than your dancer. The other way that focus can be achieved is actually through a dark object on a white background. Well, not white, but the darker object on a lighter background will also draw focus naturally. But you have to be careful with this, because if you have just a small patch of light, it can tend to draw the eye to it. What I'm trying to say is if the light is not uniform, then we will have a tendency to have our eye drawn to whatever brightest point of the composition it is, rather than the darkest point. So if you're going to go for a look that involves having the rest of the theater brighter than your dancers so that they're the focal point, it's important that that light is consistent and even, or the variety is going to draw focus away from your dance. Focus is not as important of a design concept for lighting for contemporary dance as I believe it is for other forms of dance and other forms of performing arts. You really can give a lot to a scene in a very subtle manner if, going back to that hotel example, you are just slightly decreasing the intensity where the acting is not taking place and increasing it where the acting is taking place. For dance, it gets hard to do that by changing the light as the dance goes on. It's not impossible, especially with a lot of tech time. And there are certainly areas you can go in with specials especially, and hit moments. But if you have a dance that's moving across an entire space, you are going to need to lean on side lighting and just using systems that naturally bring the focus to the dancer, rather than trying to go in and work it with specific cues for specific moments, because the moments are just going to pass too quickly to be able to realistically do that. Now that I've pasted a color wheel in here, we can talk about color theory. I'm making this up as I go along. I don't know if you can tell. So, color theory. There are three basic principles of color unity that I would like to touch on. But this is probably the wishy-washiest section of this design theory principles part of the video. Because what exactly, if you go look at a painting, it probably doesn't fall cleanly into one of these categories of color theory I'm going to talk about, and that doesn't necessarily make it bad. What allows a painting to break these rules and still look good is a bit of a mystery to me. I usually know it when I see it done right, and I can usually tell when it's done wrong, but what the distinction there is, I find hard to put into words. But these three, I guess, schools of thought within color can help you unify the color in your scene and help it naturally come out better if you're not exactly sure how to make something complex that's going to come out good. And those three are monochromatic color unity, where you choose one of these basic hues and you stick with it for the whole scene. This, now that I've got my scene rebaked, this is an example of monochromatic color unity in the blue hue. Now, it doesn't mean that you're not going to have value contrast. That's still very much going to be in the picture. And you know what? I'm actually going to rebake this really quick. Okay, I need to take a minute and rework the design a little bit, because a moment ago I still had the downlight on in blue, and that was filling in a lot of these shadows and kind of ruining the composition. And that actually leads to a point I knew I was going to get to at some point. If your lighting composition is having trouble, it can be helpful to think about what you can turn off rather than what you can turn on, at least for contemporary lighting. Sometimes when your ballet composition gets in trouble, you need to think about what you can turn on, but more often than not, your issues arise from having too many light sources filling in the value contrast, rather than not having enough light sources to do what you need to do. So, back to the idea of monochromatic color unity. This is all unified within the saturate blue hue, and you still have value contrast. You have, dark all the way down to black is fine, and all the way up to white is still fine, but you have any color that you do have is going to be the blue color, and the exact same hue of blue. You're not going to see monochromatic color unity that often in a dance lighting look, but it can happen. The second type of color unity is called analogous color unity, and that is where you are using colors from the same general area of the color wheel, but you're not necessarily restricted to just one. So, for example, a composition with analogous color unity might look something like this. You've got a light amber side light on the dancer, you have some deeper amber coming down, and the cyc is red. You've got your amber, you got your lighter amber, you got your red. This look can be good if used correctly, but you have to be careful not to fall into the pit from earlier where you're making your scene too similar. And the final type of by-the-book color theory, color unity, is complementary color unity, where you're picking colors on opposite sides of the color wheel to each other and building a composition out of them. I kind of am not crazy about this color wheel all of a sudden. But it would look something like we had in the previous example, where you've got, oh god, I don't like this either. That's good enough to get the point across, I suppose. So within the complementary color unity, you've got one color from one side of the color wheel contrasted with another color from the other side of the color wheel. In this case, you got your blue and your amber. So the design principles we just touched on are universal to many different aspects of design, from painting to software engineering, and of course lighting design. But I'd like to take a moment and contextualize these design principles within the specific tools of a lighting designer and talk about what those tools are and how they're different from some other mediums. This is a little bit of a simplification, but it is what is generally the textbook kind of rundown of lighting. So there are 4 fundamental things that you can control with your lighting. You can control the intensity, which is brightness. You can control the color. You can control the distribution, which actually has a few elements inside of it. There's the way the direction the light is shining from, how hard or soft that light is, and any texture or shape that that light may be projecting. And also movement, which is kind of an emergent property of brightness, where if you're changing the brightness over time, then that is perceived as movement in the lighting. So, after recording a whole segment on color in front of a computer screen, I realized I should probably employ the old adage, show, don't tell, and I set this up. There are 3 instruments here, even though only one is on at the moment, and I'm going to demonstrate different ways you can achieve color through your lighting instruments. There are 2 main ones that you're going to encounter in the dance world in your average venue these days. There are others, but we're not going to get there today. The older way of getting color out of an instrument was to have a incandescent white light and then take a color filter like this called a gel and put it in front of the lighting instrument in a frame when you do it for real so it doesn't fall out. I really don't want to get a frame. Okay. Put it in front of the lighting instrument to give it a color. The second option is to use LED instruments, like this one is, and that will give you any color under the sun that you want. So, there are costs and benefits of using an LED instrument versus an incandescent. With an incandescent, it's going to provide a brighter and richer white light than the LED, but the LED can provide richer color and give a lot more flexibility in terms of what kinds of colors you can get from that hanging position. There's something called a color rendering index, or CRI, and what that corresponds to is how well can something render white light. A incandescent will have a CRI of 100. An LED will have a CRI that varies depending on the quality of the LED. I get a lot of choreographers who, as soon as I mention LEDs, they are kind of retract a little bit. They're like, I don't know how I feel about that. And in short, I agree with them, at least in regards to the first generation of LEDs that hit the lighting industry. Those LEDs, they really couldn't compete on brightness with the incandescents, but they gave a lot of flexibility. Their CRI, I don't actually know off the top of my head, but probably somewhere in the mid to high 80s. Then, as LEDs have evolved and gotten better, they've gotten the CRI all the way up to 98. So that's only 2% off of a conventional when doing white light. So you're kind of getting the best of both worlds. They're still not as bright, but they're close enough that, generally speaking, they are a comprehensively better option when it's available to you. So I'm just going to start out by talking about yellow light for a moment, specifically the type of yellow light that is mixed between red and green. The reason that that light looks yellow is not exactly because it is yellow. If you were to look at the yellow light in a rainbow, that yellow is being perceived by you as yellow because it's a very narrow band of wavelengths of light. This yellow is being perceived as yellow by you because it is stimulating both the cone that detects red light and the cone that detects green light in an equal manner that also renders in your brain as yellow. It's not actually the same thing under the hood. So because we're mixing wavelengths of light here, rather than having all three instruments at full translating into a brown muddy mixture as you would with paint, it translates into a more white mixture because now you're stimulating each of those cones equally. And that, when all the cones are stimulated equally, is the same thing that happens when nice, rich white light stimulates them. Now, this still isn't the same thing. This white light in the center here, it's still not the same thing as you would get out of a incandescent. And this kind of ties into the whole color rendering thing. A saturate blue plus a saturate red plus a saturate green is going to mix to white. And on a white surface, there's really no degradation in that white. But the key difference is if, rather than spiking up the blue and the red and the green, if you have a rich white light that's hitting all of those wavelengths, then it's going to balance out and still look white, but with the key difference that now, if something with a pigment comes in, like a shirt or a hand, oh gosh, the focus, okay, yeah, if a hand comes in, the white light that's coming from the incandescent is going to look a lot better because now your brain is going to be able to see how the pigments in the hand are absorbing light across the whole range. Whereas in this, you're just getting more narrow data points, and it's going to cause the skin to look kind of muddy. Another interesting tidbit is that when you... Well, okay, so vision is comprised not just of the cones seeing color, but also rods that are detecting value, just brightness. The rods will function at a much lower light level than the cones will, because there are a lot more of them. What this means is that darker scenes are going to appear to have less color in them relative to brighter scenes. In fact, if you go outside on a bright sunny day, your rods are essentially bleached white, where the white off a sidewalk and the white off a black pavement, it doesn't matter. It's sending so much light at you that it's just pure white. The reason that you're able to still see outside, and the reason that colors look kind of richer outside, is that a lot of your vision is actually coming from the cones and what they're reporting to your brain. Another point I'd like to touch on is in regards to black fabric and black leotard specifically. The black in the costumes is not really a black pigment. It is generally just a very saturate pigment of a certain color. So I tried to do an example, but these are both red blacks, and you can't really tell on the camera anyway. But trust me, when you get under, say, saturate blue light, having everybody in a black leotard is not actually going to necessarily look the same. It might, especially if they're all from the same manufacturer. But if it's different people's black leotards, some of them may be a black that was achieved by dyeing the leotard a very, very deep blue, and others might be a leotard that was achieved by dyeing it a very, very deep red. So there are red blacks and there are blue blacks. There may be green blacks, I've never seen one, but yeah, it can be nice to, if you're going to have everybody in black, to do a light test beforehand and make sure, well, if the piece is going to be in saturate color anyway, to do a light test beforehand and make sure the blacks are actually all the same type of black. Brightness in lighting design is handled by specifying channels and intensities. The channel is an arbitrary number given to the lighting instrument just to help us remember where it is. The intensity is a percentage from 0 to 100 that corresponds roughly perceptually to what you would expect, where 100 is always as full as the light can go, 0 is always out, and then 100 perceptually even steps through there. So if you wanted to get hands-on with, say, a special, and the lighting designer has that special at 70, you can ask, okay, what percentage is that? And if they tell you 70 and you want it back a little bit, you can tell them, let's see, can we see 60? And then if you want it forward a little bit, you can say, okay, let's see 80. Or you can just tell them, bring it back a little bit, push it forward a little bit, etc. Distribution is an umbrella term. It's talking about a few different things. And these things are not present in individual photons of light. They start to emerge when you have collections of photons all doing the same thing, such as a bunch of photons coming from a single light, making a cone. Now when that cone hits the floor, there's going to be a shape. I'm now going to step through the common positions found in a theater to give a sense of what the light does when it hits a dancer from those positions. The first stop is downlight, and downlight, as the name suggests, comes from directly above the dancer. It tends to have a shortening effect in some situations where the way the shadows fall, it will make objects look a little bit shorter than they actually are. But it looks like this, and the light is hung here, shooting straight down. The next system is one we touched on in the introduction section, and that is backlight. Both backlight and downlight can be used as the only systems on, and they will give an effect that is, when paired with the right choreography, quite striking. The rendering you just saw is a 36-degree cone at a 45-degree angle, like so. The next system we're going to look at is a high side system. This is a little bit shallow of an angle, as high side systems go, but valid nonetheless. I'll zoom in so you can get a better sense of what it does on a dancer. You can have a high side system coming in from the other angle on top of this to balance out, and you can also do things like having the key light come in brighter from one side and then fill light come in from another side. High sides can be beneficial in contemporary dance when you have a lot of dancers on stage. Having a lot of dancers on stage means light coming directly from the side. As soon as it hits the first dancer, any dancers more on stage than that dancer will have intermittent shadows on them as they cross in front of each other. Whereas with a high side, you can have the light coming in and hitting this dancer, but a dancer further over here has their own light coming in and hitting them, so the dancers don't get in each other's way as much. The high side that you just saw looks something like this, a 36-degree instrument at a 45-degree angle. And as I mentioned, 60 degrees, perfectly valid. kind of anywhere in this range is going to be your typical high side angle. Next up on the agenda is the box boom position. This position gets its name because in a pit box and gallery style theater, the boxes are over on the stage walls and they can have booms near them. And then that term kind of carries over into theaters where there may not actually be boxes and may in fact not actually have booms to hang the instruments on. The light is coming in somewhat from the front, but at also somewhat of an angle. And if we go back to the rendering, you can see that this system can be a very good alternative to direct front light, whereas direct front light would help you highlight just this section of the stage by itself, and the box boom is kind of highlighting everything through here. The box boom isn't completely destroying your modeling. You can still get quite a lot of dimension from this. So this is a good system to layer in on top of a side light position or a high side position to make the dark line that sometimes appears at the edge of the dancer go away without completely ruining any nice modeling that you have going on. Next, we have the front light system. And right off the bat, you can tell the dancer is starting to look flatter relative to some of the other systems. That is to say, the front light is filling in a lot of the shadows that would help you understand how this dancer exists in 3 dimensions. It's not a complete mess, but it's not great. So why might you want to use the system? First of all, the reason you might be using the system is because you have it. If the venue you are in does not do exclusively dance, having a light focused directly on center would be a great way for that venue to be flexible in isolating that section of the stage for a particular purpose. So let's say you have a speaker coming out in front of a curtain on center. You may want to just be able to hit them with something and draw attention to them. Or you have a podium over here and you want to be able to just hit this spot. So for that reason, it's very common to find a front light system in your venue, and generally for contemporary dance, we use it to just glow enough to knock the shadow that can form from side light. Just make that a little bit lower contrast. 10-15%. Rarely does it get brought higher than that. Unless your dance centers around something to do with the face, facial expressions, facial movement. In that case, you may want to bring the front light in more than you otherwise would. This system is known as uplighting, and although I hesitated to include it at first, I have seen one designer use it to great effect. Excuse the birds in the background, they think I'm talking to them. So, unlike the other systems, I put 3 lights in for this one because it's far more common to have more overlap in this system so that the shadows on the background are less intense. If you just have one source, that shadow is very black and white, and having a scrim or a full stage black in the background can also help the shadows not be so distracting and detract from the dance as the dancer is moving. It can have somewhat of a spooky connotation to it, kind of like holding a flashlight under your face at a ghost story. It's definitely something you wouldn't want to use for no reason. It's more of a specialty system that you use because you have a specific reason to be using it. There are 3 lights commonly found on the side light booms. The shin, which is at the lowest position, the mid, which is a couple of feet up, and then the head, which is hung roughly at head height. We're going to look at these lights in isolation. You might be thinking to yourself, this doesn't actually look that good. And I would say, generally speaking, you're right about that. There may be a reason that you would have a specific moment or cue where you have only one side light on, but it's more common to use several at once, which will help fill in a lot of these really high contrast shadows that you're seeing. So in regards to shin light, there are a few schools of thought on how to focus them. So one of the real challenges with shin light is that the physical instrument takes up some space, whereas in a perfect world you'd actually want to get right down next to the floor. And as a result, if the dancer is close enough to the shin light, you start to have an effect, and this is a little bit exaggerated, but you start to have an effect where you cannot see the foot anymore, because the light simply doesn't get that low. And there are a few schools of thought of how best to handle this problem. The first is to set up your light like so that the light starts grazing the floor around centerline. This means that the shin light on the other side, if it starts grazing the floor around centerline, will make a symmetrical stage picture. And where you don't completely make the floor go away, at least the composition is balanced, and you're getting all the way down the foot on this side of the stage from this side, and you're getting all the way down the foot on this side of the stage when lighting from this side, so it helps it not look like such a big problem. Now, some lighting designers charge this problem head on and simply lower the shin light so that they can hit all the way down the foot even when the dancer is this far off stage. I don't like that approach because you start to get these areas where the light will graze the floor near the wings. In the lighting design industry, we call these scallops. And the benefits of getting all the way down the foot, in my mind, never outweigh the negatives of seeing something like this coming onto the stage all throughout the wings. Another option is to focus your shin light down at an angle like this and then stick a mirror on the end of the instrument. And what that will allow you to effectively do is get the light source really, really close to the ground and let that bottom cut be perfectly parallel with the stage. And rendered out, it looks like this. And you might think this is the best of both worlds, and to a degree, you're right, but you've just added a layer of complexity. Now, not only can the dancers bump your shin light, but they can also bump the mirror, and the floor has now gotten so dark relative to the dancer that in real life, the dancer will actually appear to float because it's hard for the brain to actually wrap our heads around what's going on when the dancer is lit so brightly relative to the ground. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. The effect is quite cool when done right, but you have to make sure that that's actually matching up with your dance before you go to those extra steps of sticking a mirror on your shin when the method of cutting to center line on both directions is close to the same, and even in some ways better if you want to acknowledge the floor a little bit. Shin light, while good, and probably the most important side light system for contemporary dance, does have a couple of drawbacks. First of all, if your dancer gets far enough off stage, then the light isn't actually making its way all the way up the dancer anymore. And in the case of ballet, a tutu can cast a undesirable shadow on the dancer's body if shin light is the only light system you use. For that reason, it's common to have a mid and a head. As you can see with the dancer off stage, there's no more weird shadow on their body from the tutu. I recognize that this applies more in the ballet world, but it's important to cover. The third light up the boom is known as the head, and it's, as the name suggests, hung roughly at head height. If you were using conventional instruments that can only be gelled one color, having your mid and your head in different colors can help increase your options in side light color because you can mix them, and they're similar enough in purpose that you can get away with using only one of the two. If you are using LED instruments and you don't have three, then it's entirely possible to hang a high, mid, or low head, depending on how you're looking at it, and just use that instrument that's shooting the same color as the shin light to take care of the shadow issues, because you don't need lots of different lights gelled lots of different ways to get your color. As long as you are getting enough brightness, it's a perfectly valid approach. If you see a fourth instrument on a boom, this one is referred to as a lift light. And it's there so that if the dancer is getting lifted by a partner, they don't get lifted out of the side light beam of other instruments. It is the least important of the four for contemporary dance. Additionally, something that is a little less obvious about light distribution is the hardness or softness, and I've baked up this example to illustrate this. In this example, the lighting in both cases is coming directly from the side. But in the example on the right, this is fairly akin to having a single instrument hitting the dance from the side. You start to see things like this line right here. And what's happening there is you have one light coming this way, one light coming this way, and the arm is blocking any of the light that would make it here. And it's also, as you were to cheat it a certain direction, you're going to be picking up more of that light, and the further you get off of that axis, the less light it's going to pick up. So if you only have a single thin light source, then it's going to, first of all, have harder shadows. You can start to see the shadows of the finger on the face, and it's going to start to have lines like this. The value contrast is higher, but that doesn't necessarily make it better. Whether you want to be using a harder looking light or a softer looking light depends a lot on what you want to do. There are absolutely reasons you might want a light this sharp, and there are absolutely reasons that you might want a light this soft. In this example, this is a computerized equivalent simulation to something that you can kind of see. If you have a lot of lights coming from the side, then now, yes, this line of darkness is there, but it has a smoother gradient because it's not an on or off anymore. Yes, that line might be blocking the light that's coming directly in parallel with the dancer, but if there's a light further down, now there's some rays kind of angled in like this as well, and those will still hit. And you can start to see the softer the light, the softer the shadows get. Now you don't see the shadow on the face from the hand anymore, because it's there in the aggregate, but there are enough other instruments coming in and filling in that it's not noticeable. Now that we've covered the four major properties of light, let's talk about the four major functions that you need to have on your mind when designing your light plot. The first is selective visibility, and this corresponds to the idea that you need to be able to take a section of the stage and fade it out. Say that's not what's happening right now. A common way to approach this in lighting design is to divide the stage up into something called acting areas. In a normal-sized stage, you might have 5 areas across and 3 deep. You might also have acting areas around certain pieces of scenery, on landings, on staircases, down stage left where this certain moment happens on the stairwell leading up to the stage or something. And what that allows you to do is if you focus a light from all of the major angles that you want to cover at that acting area, now it becomes quite easy to take the entire left side of the stage and just say that's not what's happening right now. Focus on the right side of the stage. Selective visibility is not as high a priority in dance because dance doesn't, the stage is generally more open in dance, and there isn't a need to completely take a section of the stage and say that's not what's happening right now. Additionally, and this kind of ties into directing focus, if you are leaning on side light, as you probably are when lighting contemporary dance, the side light is naturally going to head across the stage and only hit the dancer. Any light that doesn't hit the dancer is going to wind up buried in the opposite wing. So it's not really causing any problems. And this means that your dancer is, by virtue of collecting the light, going to be naturally drawing the focus, and then the other areas being naturally dark are going to naturally kind of be your selective visibility. It can still be nice, especially for more comedic or more theatrical dances, to have selective visibility at your disposal. Specials or even acting areas, if the dancer's face needs to be a major part of that particular moment in the dance. But generally speaking, revelation of form is a more important function of light for a dance plot than selective visibility. This image pulls double duty. It helps explain the revelation of form function of light as well as the focus function. On the point of revelation of form, the only difference between the two images is that the image on the left is lit by two side lights, and the image on the right is lit by one coming directly from the front. It's an exaggerated example to show how front light can flatten out the form. In regards to focus, if you let your eye wander for a moment, you may find it drawn to the image on the right as opposed to the image on the left. This is because the image on the right is brighter. As a further example of how these design concepts are universal rather than specific to lighting design, notice how the text side light starts to draw the eye away from the dancer simply by virtue of the fact that it is brighter. Of all the things on this page, mood is sort of the most wishy-washy. I don't really think of lighting as having much of a mood by itself. It certainly can in some instances, but I think of mood as more of an emergent property of the whole scene when the lighting is done right, when it's agreeing with the movement, the costumes, the sound. It is definitely doing a lot to stoke the fires of whatever mood the piece is trying to convey. I would say of these aspects, color is probably the biggest one that you're going to be playing with in order to try to make the mood right. But exactly what you should be doing and how it's going to affect the mood is on a very case-by-case basis. Because mood can vary so much on a piece-by-piece basis, I've found that sharing pieces of visual art or photography that have a certain mood can be an excellent way for a designer and a choreographer to get on the same page about the intended mood for a piece. That is going to lead us conveniently into an overview of lighting instruments and electrical knowledge. I'm going to try to keep this brief and focus on something that's going to leave you with a better understanding of lighting in general without giving you a bunch of information that you don't specifically need. Wish me luck. So, because lighting doesn't work by magic, we need lighting instruments and electricity to generate our light. I'm going to give the briefest of brief summaries about electricity so that it can help you. In a theater, you don't need to worry about electricity. But if you are doing a show outdoors somewhere, if you're doing a show in a gallery or any sort of unconventional space, a household, electricity is going to start to matter to the design. Basic household outlets are either 20 amps or 15 amps. You don't need to know exactly what an amp is, but a theatrical grade fixture that is running on an incandescent, you can get 3 of them on a 15 amp outlet, which is more common, and you can get 4 of them on a 20 amp outlet. these are LEDs and draw slightly less power. You can get 5 to 6, depending on the exact model, but do be aware that you are going to be constrained with your lighting by how many outlets are available. And it's not just each individual outlet has its own 15 amps. A lot of the time, all the outlets on a certain wall will all be going to the same breaker. So even if you plug them into different outlets, they're still fundamentally drawing power from the same source, and they will trigger overcurrent protection at a breaker box if you pull too much current out of them. And what that's basically doing is the breaker box is saying, hey, you're pulling enough electrons down these wires that they're going to start to get hot and eventually catch on fire. So I'm going to shut it off before that happens. So when assessing a potential space for lighting, the more individual 15 or 20 amp breakers, the better for your designer. Now, I would say if you want to do anything, pretty much, you are going to need at least 30 amps of power. That's at least 2 separate 15 amp outlets. With that, that's just enough to be dangerous in something like a gallery or an outdoor patio. But the more the better. Okay, moving into the theatrical fixtures themselves. If you've been in a theater for more than 5 minutes, you've probably seen fixtures like this. You may have heard them called source 4s, and if you were to refer to this as a source 4, I would know what you mean, but that's not really an appropriate name. First of all, it doesn't even have a source 4 lamp, this particular model. But even if it did, the source 4 corresponds to a specific type of lamp that's actually shared in a few different theatrical fixtures. So it's more accurate to call this instrument an ellipsoidal reflector spot, or ERS. It's also known as a profile fixture, or the industry slang word LECO, after its inventors, Levi and Cook. So there are a few features of a LECO. You've got a lens at the front, you've got shutters in the middle, you've got some sort of clutch assembly that can pan and tilt it, and then you've got a lamp or light source at the back. Despite the fact this is an LED, it doesn't fundamentally work that differently from an incandescent. It's just that it has different colors of LEDs that are driving the light rather than a single incandescent source. So the lens comes out of the instrument, and it allows you to swap lenses and make the light come out at a different size. So at the moment, this instrument has a 50-degree lens in it, and you can watch as I switch that out for a 36-degree lens that the circle gets tighter and brighter. You probably can't tell that it's getting brighter on camera, but it is. And that allows us, by shifting through the major lens types, which is 50-degree, 36-degree, 26-degree, and 19, it allows us to control the size of the cone of light coming out, and helps us, regardless of where we have to position the instrument, we can start to get consistent pools of light, and we can start to layer instruments on top of each other to have them have a unified purpose, even if their throw distances are different. So there's some other interesting features of the LECO. The first is that the lens can come in and out to make the edges of the lighting instrument fuzzier or sharper. Now, this isn't the best way to get a fuzzy edge if you want one. That's actually achieved by putting something called a piece of frost in the instrument. And by putting the light in focus and then putting a piece of frost, this is really not coming through that great, but by putting the light in focus and putting a piece of frost in the instrument, it allows you to get more light coming out of the instrument and get a more consistent edge. That brings us to the next cool feature of a LECO. It has a gate here where you can take a piece of metal with a pattern etched into it, drop it in, and it will project an upside down image of that pattern if you actually get the lens in focus. There, that's a little bit better. Yes, so you can get a texture that comes out of it by applying a filter like that, and that texture will give a dapple effect on human skin in addition to showing an image on the stage floor or whatever surface it is projected on. And the final basic feature of Alico that I'm going to cover is the shutter cuts. I think this will work. So you can see these shutters here. You can jam those down into the light, and it can start to affect the way the beam looks. And just like the gobo, it is reverse of what you are actually pushing in. So now you can see that I've made it a small rectangle by pushing the two bottom shutters in, and I can make it a square by pushing the side ones in as well. Additionally, if you need a little more flexibility, you can angle them, and you can also rotate the entire shutter assembly to help get a certain angle if you need to make a certain cut. So what that's primarily used for is if the instrument is, say, shooting down to the front of the stage and the bottom curve of the instrument is going off the stage, you could jam the shutter in and just meet it right up to the stage, and that helps the figure-ground relations because you're differentiating the stage floor out from other things, and you're drawing the focus towards what's happening on stage, not lighting up some audience seat or the front of some orchestra pit. You could do a whole dance plot with nothing but these guys. That's not typically how it's done because these are a little bit more expensive and you don't actually need this full feature set a lot of the time. The other two major instruments that you're likely to come in contact with are a par, which is basically this, but without all the fancy lenses and shutters. It will give you a soft, either circle or oval-shaped beam, and the only distinct feature of them is that oval can be rotated to in whatever orientation works best for your plot. But other than that, they're spitting out light a lot like these. They receive gel if they're incandescents, just like this would, or if it's an LED, it will have the exact same LED color options as something like this. The third type of instrument that you will likely see in a dance rep plot is some sort of cyc light fixture. And they are optimized to be able to light a cyc consistently by spreading the light down the cyc evenly, even though they are very close to the cyc. You can hang these things and just shoot light at the cyc to color it. You can hang them off to the side and have it graze, but it's better to have dedicated instruments lighting your cyc, because the closer you can get your instruments to the cyc, the less that the dancers are going to be casting a shadow on the cyc if they block the light that's heading there. In the first example, we'll be lighting a dance space with only 6 instruments. And it seems a little counterintuitive, but to an extent, lighting design gets easier the more restrictions you have. As an extreme example of this, let's suppose that you were doing a piece in a ballroom that has fluorescent lighting, no wall outlets, you have no lighting budget for any rental equipment, and you for some reason hired a lighting designer. What can that lighting designer do exactly? You can't dim the fluorescence, you don't have any budget to add any lighting instruments, there's no power for them anyway. Short of the camera on their iPhone, there's not much they can contribute beyond turning the fluorescence on and off. Now, there may be a moment in that dance piece where turning the fluorescence off at just the right time has a powerful effect. But for most of that process, they're going to be sitting there doing nothing because there's nothing that they can do. However, as you start to feed more budget and more time into those equations, then the options start to open up, and there's a space where you start to need to think very creatively about how to deploy the resources that you have. And this example will be talking you through how you might do that. The specific example I'm going to talk you through is a show I did on the back patio of a brewery back in 2019. The lighting budget was about $250. There is 80 amps of power along this wall here, so right off the bat, I know I'm going to run out of rental budget before I run out of power. It's good. Power's not going to be a bottleneck. So, how to approach this? There are a few things you could do. You could take that $250, trot down to the store, buy a bunch more of this rope light, and run it back and forth over the stage to get kind of a soft downlight effect, and call it good. That is going to have a certain mood, a certain warmth, and it's going to fit certain pieces. One could also approach this by lighting it more like a conventional show in a conventional theater. And if I were to do it that way, right off the bat, I would be thinking about putting the instruments on the ground. And I'll tell you why. If you were to rent the booms and boom basses to build some sort of structure that goes over the dance floor, you are going to eat up so much of that $250. Well, actually, if you did 3 booms across the stage, you've probably eaten up that entire lighting budget just getting your hanging positions set up. So you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck if you just put the lighting instruments on the ground, and that is achieved through the use of something called a pigeon plate. It's just a square of wood that's bolted to the bottom of the instrument that lets it sit on the ground and serve like a side light or a special. So if you're doing a show in a theater or outdoors or anywhere without real hanging positions, don't be surprised if your lighting designer starts pulling out lights on plates, because it's just a very cost-effective solution of getting the light out. Additionally, you could do something very off the wall with a show like this. You could take that $250, you could go down to Hardware Freight and buy a bunch of flashlights and give them to the audience. And just have the audience point those flashlights wherever they want, and then the lighting kind of becomes a living, breathing entity that comes from what all the audience members decide to shine their lights on. Now, if you do that, it's going to be a little bit flat, but the mood could be quite interesting if it fit the piece that was happening. But in this specific situation, it's a few different pieces, and doing that is not going to fit all of them. So, for the sake of this example, let's say we decide to go with the more theatrical approach. $250 is going to rent you about 6 instruments and the dimming and control and cabling you need to run them, give or take. Just look back through my text message history, and the stage was 24 feet across and 20 feet deep. So right off the bat, I would start thinking about using larger coned instruments. You know, as I was switching the lenses out there, you saw the size of the cone change. And I would use a larger instrument cone because if you were to take this to be the front view of the stage, and you have a side light coming in like this, if you have, let's say, a 6-foot tall person on quarter line, and you only rented a 19-degree fixture, then the light coming from the side is going to do something kind of like this, okay? So this is the light in the side. It's shooting up there, which means it's cutting off around their midriff or so. On the other hand, if you do the same thing, but it's a 50-degree cone of light, they're more than covered. And they're covered even if they're close to the side of the stage. You have to get very close to the edge of the stage before a 50-degree over here isn't lighting your face anymore as a 6-foot-tall person. So I would rent 650 degrees. The next step is to decide how to deploy them around the stage. As you might have guessed from the talk of design principles thus far, it makes a lot of sense to put all of them on the side. But that raises a question, how exactly should we deploy them? You know, we have all the space in the world. We can kind of put them anywhere we want here within reason. So it may be natural to say, well, what if we just stick one, what if we just divide the stage up into thirds and stick one at each third? So you might stick one here, you might stick one here, and you might stick one here. That would be taking the rectangle and then evenly sticking one in. And let me show you what's going to happen if you do that. And this is the same 50-degree cone as before. So if you do that and move the cones of light into place, again, this is looking top down, you're going to have some issues. You don't have any light covering these triangles here or this wedge here. And it's going to be the exact same case on the other side. It is very common for instruments to be arranged in a symmetrical pattern. So we're starting to move in the right direction here. We have more of this instrument that is hitting the actual dancers. No longer do we have the light coming out here and some of this light winding up in maybe someone's eyes or something. And no longer do we have light going out over here that we don't need anymore. We're salvaging more of the light and pointing it at the stage. So we're moving in the right direction, but we still have these two dead zones here to contend with. And the best way to deal with those is simply to pull the instruments back from the stage a bit more. So if we do that, immediately they start to go away. And there's really no reason that we can't pull this one back a little bit more than the others. You don't want to do that to too big of an extent, or it will start to look noticeably dimmer, but a little bit is okay. Lighting design in general is fairly forgiving. You don't have to be down to the inch to make it appear to the human eye that everything is normal. So this is starting to look better. It may be difficult to see what's going on, but essentially you have this lighting instrument, and then you also have this lighting instrument, and you also have this lighting instrument. I can't tell if that made it better or worse, but regardless, you don't have those dead zones anymore, so that's a step in the right direction. And you're starting to get a property where the further stage right you go, the more of these lights are hitting you. And that helps counterbalance a problem where when you're close to the wing or exiting, the side light is closer to you and making you exponentially brighter when that isn't necessarily what's ideal for the focus of the scene, which might be further on stage. This isn't solving that, but it is helping it a little bit because now, instead of this person being, I don't know, an eighth as bright as this person, it's not as bad because they're getting hit some by these two instruments when this person is only getting hit by this one. And that is a perfectly reasonable way to deploy $250 worth of lighting gear to light a dance piece. If we look at this through the lens of the design principles for a moment, we haven't covered all of our bases, which you're not really realistically going to be able to do all of the time. You're probably not going to be able to rent LED instruments for $250, and even if you did, the fact that this is outdoors means they're probably not a smart choice. So, in terms of color, you're going to be limited to something that you could color them with an individual gel. You could feasibly change that gel out in between pieces, but once the lights fade up, you're locked into that color, and the fact that you have only 6 instruments really limits your ability to have different colors layering on top of each other in nice ways. And if there are different costumes on stage, it starts to become very hard to find a color that really agrees with all of them, except for white light. So, for this show, we kept them all in white light. And that's perfectly okay. The brightness can be controlled via the dimmers that we rented. The distribution, we probably don't want to put any texture in them. That might be okay for 1 piece out of 20, but the other 19 pieces are going to be far better off with just the normal flat white light. We're employing direction that makes sense for us. There isn't really much of a shape to these instruments. If they are coming up and doing this right here, then this is the front on view, then the light isn't really going to be hitting the floor and causing much of a shape. Any light that doesn't hit the dancers is just going to go off and be shot into the sky. And it decently ticks the checkbox of revelation of form, in the sense that it looks more like this than this. It's starting to sculpt and mold. In that hardness versus softness tug of war, it's not going to be as hard as this, and it's not going to be as soft as this. It's going to be somewhere in between, which is, you know, we're putting it in the best place that we can with the resources available. You can't really ask more than that of your designer. There's not much in terms of selective visibility. We can kind of isolate the stage in thirds to a degree, but even then, when we look at this, if we turn these lights off, then we're only actually cutting off the selective visibility for this chunk, because it's not exactly this aisle anymore. It's this, it's this cone. So anyone back here, we can't really have them be dark and this person be light. But that's okay, because if we had the cones going directly across, while that would give us a greater degree of selective visibility, it would be worse in virtually every other way. So this makes more sense, and this kind of illustrates the point where I'm saying that the revelation of form for dance lighting is a higher priority than the selective visibility. The focus is decent because, once again, the light that's not hitting the dancers isn't hitting anything, so the dancers are naturally the brightest thing in the composition. That's good. No Color Shin Light does have a little bit of a mood. It's something you don't see every day. But I wouldn't say that this light plot by any means is the best thing that you could achieve for these dances. It's just the best thing you can achieve for $250. Next, we're going to look at a basic dance rep plot and start to examine why some of the choices were made that were made, how to interpret the document, and just generally try to demystify what is going on when you look at the lighting in a theater. This is a 2-scale drawing of DeMille Theater at University of North Carolina School of the Arts. I chose it because it's a venue that myself and the original person who asked the question that sparked this video both know, and I helped design it back when I was a student there. I'll do a quick flyover here so that you can hopefully start to understand the hanging positions and how the theater exists in 3D space. Then I'll start to talk you through how to read the light plot and some common features. The light plot, in essence, is a 2-scale drawing. That means that it is proportionally accurate to the real-life space. In this case, a 1/2 inch on the light plot represents a full foot in reality. The lighting instruments are notated in the plot by these two-dimensional symbols that have useful information about them. At the back, we see 90, which corresponds to the channel number. So if a lighting designer wanted to indicate to their light board operator that this instrument was to be brought on, they could say 90 at full. The slash across the barrel indicates that this is a 26-degree instrument. That is to say, the cone of light coming out of it is 26 degrees across. The R305 is a designation of gel, in this case a light amber. The front is a purpose. The purpose isn't commonly found on a light plot, but can be nice just to make a rep plot a little bit more clear to people who might be picking it up for the first time. These dark bold lines correspond to hanging positions, and it is customary that the hanging positions count up as you move away from the proscenium arch in each direction. So you see 1, 2, 3 going this way, 1, 2, 3 going this way. These instruments with slashes on them indicate that this is the footprint for instruments that are notated elsewhere. So this boom here corresponds to this boom here as you look down. As mentioned previously, a group of instruments that all have the same function are known as a system. This is a system of dead-on front light. There is also a system of front light on these box boom areas, which are notated here. These can be used as toners to bring in some color, or as front light that is more focused on keeping revelation of form than it is on selective visibility. The light plot also has two systems of downlight, one in cool and one in warm. These triangular shapes here indicate that there are barn doors, which are flaps of metal that can be used to better form the lights if they don't have dedicated optics. We have a system of heads, mids, and shins, which is typical to find in a dance rep plot, as well as cyc lighting in amber, blue, and red. On the top of the booms, we find an instrument to the left and an instrument to the right that together make a high-side system. The instrument to the left is here on the top-down view, and the instrument to the right is here. This may make it more clear. I'll now be demonstrating how the spacing of these instruments is determined. I'm only going to do one system this way because all lighting systems are variations on this same theme. This is a section view of the theater. If you can imagine slicing it in half like an apple and looking at the right half, this is what you would see. In order to determine the proper spacing for instruments in our front light system, we'll be drawing a cone into the section view that corresponds to how the light will flow out. In this case, we're interested in how best to blend the instruments for a target at roughly the height of a human face. This is known as the lighting plane. If we account that the instrument will take up 1.5 feet or so of space here, we can say the light starts here, ends roughly here, and this is known as our throw distance. For dumb reasons, the 26-degree instrument hung here has a cone of 25 degrees. That can be represented with this arc. When this arc gets pivoted down to the edge of the stage, we can start to learn a few things about the light. First of all, we can tell if it's focused like this, the top edge of the light will bury itself around here in the corner of the theater, which means we'll probably want to shutter it just a little bit to get it off the cyc. Now, if we take this cone that we just drew, copy it, paste it into the plan view, which is a top-down view of what is going on, and then put it in front of the instrument in question, we can now start to see how wide that cone is going to be when it hits the target. It's a good rule of thumb to space the instruments out so that the center line of the next instrument impacts the edge of the previous. And as we can see, the instruments here roughly do that. Now, you might notice it's a little bit off. And that brings me to a point I alluded to earlier, which is that there is a certain degree of play in the lighting instruments. It does not have to be perfect down to the inch for it to look forgiving to the human eye. The last step on our light plot journey is to double check our masking. The idea here is that the lens of an instrument, if that instrument is on, is going to oftentimes be the brightest thing in the composition if it is visible to the audience. That is, it will make it easier for the audience to focus on the dance if their eye isn't getting drawn up to the light sources that are lighting that dance. So, with the first row of seats here, we can draw straight lines to get a decent idea of where their vantage point would be and what they're going to be able to see and what they won't be able to see. If the edge of the proscenium arch is here, we can draw a line here, and that tells us that they cannot see this par instrument. If the people in the front row can't see it, then the people further up can't see it. We can continue drawing these straight lines, and we can see that the first border here will block the ability to see this par. But you can see if that border wasn't there, that they would be able to see it. They could see under the proscenium arch, and the border would not be there to block their view of that instrument. So generally, you simply fan lines out like this on the section view to make sure that your borders are low enough and that your electrics are high enough that your instruments can't be seen. And that is what it looks like to verify that all of the sight lines are okay. These instruments here in the box boom position are going to have their lenses be visible to some audience members. One thing you can do to help alleviate this problem is to slot a piece of metal called a half hat into the front of the instrument, and it will essentially have a protruding piece of metal here that when people's view comes in from this side, it will block the lens from being seen, but it will let all the light flow out to the stage this way. When I got to this point here about using the plot to actually light a dancer, my original plan was to build a cue, but with the computer-generated space we have, the dancer's costume isn't in color, and it's obviously a frozen moment in time without the benefit of the wider context of a piece, and there's no movement. So I don't think it's actually realistic to try to build an actual cue here to talk about. I may try next time I have a rehearsal video and then have enough time during tech to talk through the lighting steps as I'm building the piece and get permission from the choreographer and so forth and upload that to the channel later. But I don't think I'm going to be able to cover this point quite the way I originally intended. But after thinking it over, I did want to expand a little bit on this point. The biggest thing I wish choreographers would tell me. So I'm going to amend the presentation, and in addition to talking about the biggest thing I wish choreographers would tell me, I'm going to also talk about the designer-choreographer relationship in general a little bit. And it's hard to say anything absolute about this relationship because people are so different, situations are so different. Some choreographers want to get their hands on with the lighting a lot more than others. Some are very passive. Some will only talk about the concept and then leave the rest in my hands. Others will go all the way down to telling me specific channels at specific values. I even had a choreographer once show me how to focus one of my systems that did in fact work a little bit better in that venue for that show. Personally, I don't mind when choreographers do that. I don't mind when they get hands-on with their piece, and I'll tell you why. In my mind, they have the most concrete idea of what their piece is supposed to be. So, the more direct they get with the lighting, that's not a problem to me. I don't get possessive over my designs, but I think it is important to note not all designers are like that, especially designers that do a lot of... Let's go back to that hotel example one more time. If you're doing a play as a lighting designer and you've spent a lot of time with light rigs, and yes, it's a collaborative art form, and yes, you work under the director, but really with all your training and experience, you're probably gonna have the best idea of how to craft the lighting for that scene. So if someone comes to you and tells you, I want it done differently, well, it's somewhat understandable that your first reaction would be defensive, that you don't want to make those changes. That's not the way I am about my designs, but I do understand it, and it's something you may encounter. It varies a lot on a designer-to-designer basis. The first time I ever work with a choreographer, I try to let them know in some roundabout way that they are the one ultimately in charge. And if we disagree for whatever reason, I may warn them that something that they're trying to do violates some design principle, but ultimately I'm always going to do what they want for their piece. That is especially important in a show where there can be many different choreographers and pieces, and maybe the entity producing it is a different entity entirely, so those choreographers aren't even directly hiring me. I've found gets murky as to who's in charge ultimately, so I like to clarify that I consider the choreographer in charge. But your mileage may vary on that. I can't tell you what the percentage breakdown is of designers out there and how they approach it. In fact, that'd be something I'd be interested to hear from you. And in the comments, if you have any questions about this, feel free to leave a comment, and I will do a follow-up video addressing them if there's enough substance there and enough interest for me to answer those questions, because I'm not entirely sure what areas I might be leaving out. There may be parts of this video that are obvious to me, but I didn't make obvious to you, and there may be parts of this video that were too obvious and I shouldn't have covered them. So I'm interested to hear your perspectives on that in the comments. And that brings me to the final point, and that's the biggest thing I wish choreographers would tell me. And it's something I don't ask. And I'm going to have to back up a little bit and explain a certain relationship in lighting design, and that's the relationship between, risk and reward, for lack of a better word. One time in, this would have been 2013, I lit a piece that revolved around childhood innocence and childhood play. In this piece, I made the decision late in the piece to have some of the light crew crawl up on the catwalk and blow bubbles that kind of took the audience by surprise near the end of the piece. Thematically, those bubbles fit in quite well with the design, and I think it was a successful artistic choice. But it came with risk. First of all, anything that you do in lighting design that draws attention to yourself, in my mind, has a risk of being a net negative to the piece. That good choreography is going to speak for itself in a way that, more often than not, you're better just having your hands off. But even if you get past that risk and you found something that you think benefits the piece that you can do, let's take that bubble example. What if that bubble stuff damaged the Marley chemically in some way? You know, what if someone dropped a vial of the bubble stuff in the piece And now the Marley is too slippery for the dancers to finish the piece out. Someone could trip and get hurt. At best, we're going to have to stop and mop that up, and now it's wet for the next piece. You know, they're not going to be very appreciative of that. Something could be dropping someone's head and someone's eye. I mean, the list goes on. So you always need to consider when you're making design choices, kind of going back to that flashlight versus theatrical lighting instruments for that piece out in that patio. You know, what, if I'm going off the beaten path, what are the risks in doing that? So the biggest thing I wish choreographers would tell me is what their risk tolerance is. Do they understand that that relationship exists between risk and payoff? Do they understand that this may not work in this specific instance, but it may have been smart to try it anyway? And if a choreographer, let's say there are 5 pieces in the show, and the choreographer comes to me and they say, I want to shoot the moon. I want your craziest ideas. And I don't care if they don't work. I want this piece to either be the worst piece in the show, or I want it to be the one that everyone's talking about on the way home. That's a really valuable piece of information for me, because I'm going to approach how I'm thinking about the lighting completely differently. I'm first going to try a bunch of stuff. I'm going to first think about a bunch of stuff off the beaten path, and then if I can't find anything good there, I'm going to start thinking about things in regards to a more natural light plot for that piece. So this is something at the moment, I never mentioned to choreographers. I try to read the room, and it's also dependent on time, because if you're just the worst case scenario is when you just meet the choreographer right as you start the tech for the piece. Even if you can just have a 15-minute conversation with them at a coffee shop, like even if you don't talk about the piece, just getting to know them a little bit first is really, really, really beneficial. So if you can meet your designer in any capacity before the piece and talk with them, that's going to help a ton. And then if there's time, because another aspect of this is there tech time in the process to actually even be able to take the risk? If we're meeting for the first time at tech and the tech is 30 minutes long, none of that, off the beaten path stuff is on the table at that point, because there's just not enough time to find it and implement it. And that about concludes the video. I hope it has been informative to see how a dance lighting designer thinks about light, about design, about dance. I cannot guarantee that my views on the philosophy of contemporary dance lighting are going to agree with your lighting designers. I can't promise that they are going to think about that relationship and putting you in charge. I can't guarantee they're going to agree with me on that either. Those are more takes that are, for me personally, that I've developed over time. And I'd also like to once again state the caveat that these design principles are guidelines. They're not laws. They're just there to help you make better work on average. There are rational reasons why we follow certain principles, but depending on the context of the piece, you can do anything, just like with choreography. And I think it's important not to forget that. And that's as good of a note as any as I can think to leave it on. So have a nice day.